Hi everyone, welcome back to another Math 9 video. We are going to have a pretty short one today, just an introduction to our chapter on statistics. And so we are first starting out with this 8.1 and 8.2. I've combined both of them because you'll see pretty soon here that there's not a lot of information there. Population versus sample in statistics, and when to use population or sample in statistics. So we'll start first by just talking about what population is. The totality of all things under consideration. So for us, let's talk about who would make up the population of Lord Byng. So we know that it would be made up of students, teachers, building engineers, office staff, support staff, like there's lots of people. But maybe for our purposes, we would just think of students. And so to put things into perspective, at Lord Byng, we have around 1,300 students, and they would be made up of, so I'm going to say this, that we have our students. And for those students, we would have grades 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. So we're dealing with 5 different grades, but together all of those grades make up the entire population. So there's a reason why I'm laying it out this way. You'll see as we get into this. The next thing we're talking about is a sample. So that'd be a portion of the population selected for analysis. For example, the student council represents a sample of the Lord Byng population. So that's one type of sample. We could also take, for example, a basketball team, or we could take a volleyball team, or we could take a strings class, or we could take theater company students. But if all those samples we are talking about are sort of an example of convenient sampling because they're already in a group, they're already grouped together, and maybe it's not a fair representation of the entire population of Lord Byng, because chances are if those students are in a group together, whether it's drama or theater or music or sports, whatever it is, or student council, oftentimes those are like-minded people that have ended up together. So that would be one type of convenient sampling. Another type of convenient sampling is, let's say I wanted to do a survey to find out some information, and I just decided to survey your class. So your class is a convenient sample for me because you're already in my class. I have easy access to information or to ask you questions. But having just a Math 9 class as a sample is not a fair representation when we take a look at the entire population that we're working with. But a lot of times we will do that. It just depends on what it is we're trying to find out from our survey or from our information. Number 2, we have voluntary response sampling. I feel like the name says it all. So that's where, let's say you have a survey and you put it out there to everyone, and just whoever decides to volunteer and chooses to volunteer, or those are the responses you're going to get. Again, that's probably a little bit biased because you're going to have people who are motivated or enjoy doing that sort of thing that are going to be volunteering. Whereas maybe people who don't have an interest in that sort of thing aren't going to respond. So maybe you're going to get a skewed set of results because of the fact that people are volunteering. Number 3 is a TV or online survey. So that would be, you've actually done a lot of these. We'll use the online example. Like let's say you have something that is sent out to you through Microsoft Teams from the school. You could fill that out as a survey and send that back. But that also, depending on how it's set up, that could be kind of like the volunteer response sampling. And number 4 would be random samples. So let's say I really wanted a fair representation of the Byng population. Maybe I would look at get a list from the office of all 1,300 students, or obviously the computer would have to help with this, if we randomly generated just a sample of, let's say, 500 students, but they're all over the map, different grades, different gender, different ethnicity, that would be a random sample. So the reason why there's different types of sampling is these things can happen. There's different influences on sampling. So I already sort of mentioned bias. So bias is when something, I guess, could be perceived as being unfair or it's been skewed in a certain direction. So it basically is something that is going to impact your results to not give a fair or adequate representation of the general population. For example, I mentioned, let's say we surveyed the student council. If we surveyed the student council and in the survey there were questions about, let's say, a school dance, should we have a school dance? Well, if it's the student council who has come up with the school dance and they want that school dance to occur, then they're going to have a biased answer or response to that. So that's one example. I hope that helps to clear that up a little bit for you. Number 2 is use of language. So in a survey, you can use language that would steer people in the direction that you want it to go in. So you have to be really careful that if you really do want to come up with a fair survey, you're not trying to manipulate or convince people to go in one direction versus the other, then your use of language should be very neutral. It should be fair. It should be open. So you shouldn't be trying to convince people to vote in a certain direction or to move things in a certain direction. Number 3 is ethics. And ethics would just have to do with, well, basically, to put it in simple terms, knowing the difference between right and wrong. So if you are, I don't know that in our situation at Lord Byng that this would come up quite so much, but sometimes in sampling, well, you would want to make sure that you're coming up with a survey that is ethical, that you're asking questions that are fair and justified, and you're taking things into consideration. For number 4, for privacy, oftentimes, and you've found this through surveys that are sent to you from the school, the surveys are anonymous, so you wouldn't put your name on it, so you can answer truthfully. You don't need to worry about judgment or who's going to see this information. So that's one way that you could deal with privacy, is you could make sure that it's anonymous and no one finds out. If you do want names included for whatever reason, there's 2 different ways that can go. If you want to be able to share those names, you need to get permission from the people that you're surveying. That's probably pretty rare, because I think if you're surveying people, you'd want it to be private and confidential. So if it is private and confidential, even if they've put their name on it, then you wouldn't have the right to share who these responses are coming from. So those are things that kind of ties in closely with ethics, actually. So you just want to make sure that, like, surveying or asking people information, that might be very sensitive and private information. So you want to be sure that you're treating people respectfully. An easy way to deal with it, treat other people the way that you would want to be treated. Number 5 is cost. So influences on sampling. If we're dealing with the Lord Byng population, this probably wouldn't be much of an issue. But if you're doing samples and you want to get people from all over the world, and it's like your experiment or your survey is super costly, there's a whole bunch of technology and things that you would need to involve, then cost is something you would want to consider. Like most things in life, the more time, resources, and fees or money that you can put into anything that you're doing, oftentimes that means that your results would be better. Number 6, time and timing. I think I sort of just covered that. And then cultural sensitivity. So this is a great one, because this is something that we these days have been talking about, and it's been coming up a lot. A lot of times in Canada, we tend to, not just in Canada, I would say this is probably all over, but Canada and Vancouver, we're very fortunate that it's such a diverse place. We have so many different cultural groups, races, languages, foods. We've talked about this before. It's incredibly diverse. We're so lucky to have that. But a lot of times, still, when we have surveys or things that are on TV or conversations that come up, it's usually about one dominant group, one dominant cultural group. So, if you are asking questions or doing a survey, you want to be sure that you are sensitive to different cultural groups and that you're not making assumptions and that you're sort of trying to take a broad perspective instead of just looking at it from one narrow-minded perspective. So I hope that helps to clear this up a little bit. The next thing we'll talk about is something called a census, which I think you've probably heard your parents talking about at some point. It's a survey that includes every member of the population. So the Stats Canada sends out a census survey to every household every few years to gather information. And the reason and the purpose for that is basically to find out, like, for example, there's lots of things included, but one common example is they might ask the household income. They might ask the number of people living in that household, the number of children living in that household, the number of cars that household has. And so all of these questions are basically to gather information about a population or a society so that we can then use that information, or the government can use that information to make decisions that are appropriate to help better society, to help, that helps with some of the laws, the regulations, the things that they put in place for what the need is. Instead of just randomly making decisions, it allows them to make informed decisions about what would be needed in society. And statistics is the part of the population we examine and for which we do have data. So the census is one example of that. The science of collecting, analyzing, presenting, and interpreting data. And just before we finish things off here, and I draw your attention to the work that you are doing, one really big area where we're seeing lots of statistics being given to us every day is with the pandemic, with all the numbers that are shared to keep track of. And again, the reason for that, the reason that we collect that data and we analyze it, is we then use those numbers to make sense of what's going on so that we can make decisions based on that to help our society, to improve things, to make better decisions.